Hey, my IO Psych students. I hope you don't mind very briefly. I thought I would show you the silly shirt I'm wearing today. It says treat yourselves. Treat yourself, treat yourselves. And well, I've got my bubbly here, so I am actually treating myself. So I hope you're having a wonderful week. I hope that you had a great weekend. And today and for the rest of this week, we're going to talk about aspects related to job attitudes and different feelings about work. So just a couple of quick reminders for you. So your homework number 7 is due Tuesday, April 7th. I have a prompt for you about person job fit for the Shelley Club observations that you did. If you were not able to get a sufficient number of observations at the Shelley Club, feel free to use another job if you need to. Homework 8 will Homework 8 will be due on the 16th, and your third exam will also be due on the 16th. Now, before we get to that point, we are going to cover job satisfaction and attitudes. Our next lecture will cover organizational commitment, productive and counterproductive workplace behaviors, and then finally we'll close with occupational health and safety. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. So we're going to talk about the role of attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. We're going to in particular focus on job satisfaction. What are the antecedents of job satisfaction? So what sort of things increase job satisfaction? And what are the consequences of job satisfaction? And then finally, we're going to close with a discussion about emotions at work. So we're going to start by focusing on attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. And I'm going to go ahead and move my head down there. So before we actually start, I'd like you to take a moment to think about a time where you worked at a job that you did not like. And I want you to think about how it affected your performance, how it affected how you felt about the tasks that you did, how you felt about your coworkers. And odds are pretty good if you don't like your job, unless you have some other things potentially compensating at that job. One of the things that we often find is that if you don't like your job, it does have a tendency to kind of color how you approach everything else with that job. And this now, I'd like you to kind of think about this. What about a job that you absolutely loved? Did it affect your performance, your feelings about your tasks, your coworkers? Odds are pretty good that when you like your job, and you won't like your job all of the time. Like, I love my job, and sometimes there are some parts of the job that I just do not like. But generally, I like my job. And at least for me, I find when I'm satisfied with my job that it energizes me. It helps me do my best work because I care and because I enjoy it. So one of the things we're going to talk about is the role that job satisfaction plays in how we think about a job and how we approach a job. And that can make a really huge difference in how we approach work. So we have to start when we talk about job satisfaction, we have to first start by talking about attitudes, because how you feel about work is in effect an attitude. Job satisfaction has an attitudinal component. So an attitude is the degree of a positive or negative feeling that you have about a person, a place, or a thing. So as I kind of mentioned, why am I talking about attitudes when a few seconds ago I was talking about job satisfaction? Well, attitudes are going to shape our behavior at work. Generally, we want to improve our attitude towards work. They can help us understand our working life and our non-working life as well. So one of the ways that we can think about the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, at least as it pertains to work, is Isaac Agin's theory of planned behavior. So according to this model, before we ever engage in any sort of behavior, we always consider the consequences or the implications of that behavior. One of the other things that we do is we focus on rational choices and decisions. Now, if any of you have had me for cognitive psychology, you probably know that this is the part where you might start to scoff a little bit. Because if there's one thing that we've learned from cognitive psychology, it's that our choices are not always as rational as we would like them to be. We're only going to be as rational as the circumstances allow us. But this is Ajzen's theory. Ajzen's theory of planned behavior. Now, here's what's really critical according to Ajzen. Our intent to perform an action helps determine the action. So the idea is that if you perform a certain type of behavior on some level, you intended to do so. And your intention will affect whether or not the action gets performed. So intention affects behavior. Groundbreaking, right? So here's kind of how this works. Can you actually predict intention? Well, yes, and on some level, no. Because intentions have a few important antecedents. So first of all, our attitude will affect our intention. If we don't like work, we aren't necessarily going to have the intention of doing better. Norms can also influence our intentions as well. So the norms that society sets for us also affect our intentions, and intentions affect behavior. So, for example, let's kind of take this into a workplace example. So let's say that it's your goal to meet a deadline. You're only going to meet that deadline if it's a workplace norm. Like if your workplace doesn't care about meeting deadlines, there's not really a subjective norm to influence that intention. But if it's something that your workplace values and enforces, you're going to be more likely to do that. If a worker has a positive attitude towards meeting deadlines, if they think it's important to meet those deadlines, they will actually form the intention of doing so. So what this kind of tells us is that attitudes, in addition to other aspects, will affect our behavior. Now, none of this sounds particularly groundbreaking, but it still is important to show that intentions have certain antecedents that must occur if you're to have that intention and perform that behavior in the first place. But your perceived control matters too. And that not only affects your intentions, it also affects your behavior. So depending on how much control you think you have over the environment or over your work, that's going to potentially affect the intentions that you form. And it's also going to affect your behavior as a result. So let's say, for example, that a factory norm is to produce 200 units. And a worker really wants to meet this goal. But if the worker finds that equipment breakdowns are frequent, that's going to lower that level of perceived control. And the worker may even have the intention of producing 200 units, but they're certainly not going to be able to. So in some ways, Ajzen's theory of planned behavior is similar to VI. Even if there's something we value, and even if meeting this goal will produce good outcomes, we're not going to be motivated if we don't believe that our effort is going to affect the goal in any way, even if we have that intention. Now, the theory of planned behavior takes this further. Now, let's kind of go back to this model really quick. Notice that perceived control not only affects intentions, it also affects behavior in a way that attitude really doesn't and a subjective norm doesn't. So this has a very important implication for us. Even if you intend to perform that behavior, if you perceive a lack of control, you won't. And that's because perceived control not only affects intentions, it affects behavior as well. Now let's take this into how this plays into job satisfaction. So job satisfaction is a positive emotional state that results from a cognitive appraisal, and that's what's really critical. It's a cognitive appraisal of your job or job's experiences. or job experiences. And researchers like Locke back in 1976 said that job satisfaction really stems from the perception that your job fulfills you. Now, you may not necessarily get all of your life's fulfillment from your job. In fact, I would argue it's important to make sure that there's no one thing that is responsible for all of your sense of fulfillment, but your job can be fulfilling, and that's really what job satisfaction is. Now, there are two different components to this job satisfaction. There is an affective component, the emotion that you feel, and that cognitive component, the evaluation of that. So let's talk about how we can consider job satisfaction. So job satisfaction has several different antecedents that affect and modify whether or not you feel job satisfaction at all. So first of all, the characteristics of the job are going to be really important. So if you require a job that has a lot of task variety, and your job actually has that task variety, that's going to help contribute to a positive feeling of job satisfaction. On the other hand, if you require a lot of task variety and your job isn't giving you that, you're probably going to have a lower sense of job satisfaction. If you require a great deal of feedback and your job doesn't give you that, you're not going to have that job satisfaction. So all of those job characteristics that we talked about in the Hackman and Oldham model last week play a role in this. You have to have a pretty good understanding of what job characteristics work for you and which ones don't. And you need to very carefully consider if the job that you're in actually meets those characteristics. Your personal characteristics also play a role. So for example, if you're an introvert and you're having to do jobs where you have to frequently interact with people, such as retail, call centers, things like that, this might be a very, very difficult job for you. So you have to be aware of your personal characteristics and whether or not they work well under this particular job. So we have to think a little bit about the person-job fit. What are the aspects of this job, and how does a person's personality actually interact with that? There are social factors. So that includes the relationship that you have with your boss, the relationship that you have with your coworkers, and opportunities for growth. So another thing that we kind of talked about last week when we talked about motivation was that some people have a very high need for what we call growth need strength. They believe that for them to feel fulfilled in their job, there have to be opportunities to progress and grow in their career. Some people really need that. Some people really don't. For people that have a very high growth need strength, they need to feel as though there are opportunities for growth in order to feel satisfied with their job. If you don't really care about job like growth opportunities, then this won't really affect job satisfaction as much. But if you're in a situation where you want to grow, you want to progress, and those opportunities for growth are not being provided for you, that is going to negatively impact your job satisfaction. So now let's talk about what the consequences of job satisfaction are. Job satisfaction, so we're talking about high job satisfaction. When you like your job, that enhances your performance. It makes you work harder. It makes you work better. It decreases the likelihood of withdrawal behaviors. So typically we'll see less absenteeism, less tardiness, less turnover, fewer counterproductive behaviors. So you're going to be less likely to engage in behaviors that harm the organization or harm your coworkers. And so let's talk a little bit more about these antecedents in detail. So going back to the job characteristics theory. So factors that do tend to especially aid in job satisfaction or motivation, we generally focus on skill variety. So how many different tasks do you have to do? Task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. So as a reminder with task identity, when you are performing a task, do you complete a finished whole product, a unified product, or are you doing part of a whole project? Like putting a cap on toothpaste. For task significance, is the job that you're doing deemed to be very, very important? Autonomy is, do you have a lot of say in how you produce this work, or do you have to answer to somebody else? And feedback also plays a role. So are you getting feedback from your higher ups? Generally, the more that people perceive these characteristics, the more that they like their jobs. Now, having said that, I think it's also really important to have a good understanding of whether or not you require these different aspects in your job. If skill variety does not matter to you, and your job doesn't really have a lot of skill variety, that may not be an issue for somebody. But if somebody has a need for skill variety and the job doesn't really have that, that's going to lead to dissatisfaction. So in addition to those job characteristics, the workload matters as well. So generally, we tend to find that a workload plays a role. You want to make sure that you're doing enough to feel productive, but not so much that you feel overwhelmed. Now, how do personal characteristics play a role? You have stable characteristics that predispose how you will respond in certain types of job contexts. So, are you an extrovert? Are you an introvert? Are you detail-oriented? Are you more of a big picture thinker? So very simply put, because everybody has their own personal characteristics that predispose whether or not they will like certain aspects of their job, very simply put, this means that job satisfaction will vary across persons. Now, stability in job satisfaction may actually stem from your affective position. Disposition rather. Are you generally a happy person? Are you somebody that is a little bit moody, or are you more of a negative person? Generally, we tend to find that an affective disposition can play a role in this. So generally, affective disposition occurs when you respond to environmental stimuli in predetermined affect-based ways. So generally, somebody with a positive affective disposition, they're probably going to be like me. They're pretty upbeat, they're pretty energized, they're pretty happy. Somebody with a negative affective disposition might appear to be more down, weary, and sad. And it turns out that research has actually found, and this comes from Staw and Cohen-Cherish in 2005, your affective disposition can affect what you experience in the workplace, how you evaluate it, and how you remember it later on. So your disposition affects how you interpret what goes on at work and how important it is to you. So it basically acts as a filter for your different experiences. Now, here's something kind of interesting. A few researchers have actually argued that genetics could potentially affect job satisfaction. In fact, it's possible that genetic factors could affect how you respond to a work context. And on some level, this makes some sense. Genes affect your intelligence, they affect your personality traits and dispositions, your interests, and so on. In fact, Arvey and colleagues back in 1989 did a study of twins using the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, which allows us to take a look at variability due to genetics versus variability due to environment. And Arvey and colleagues actually found that about 30% of the variance that we see in job satisfaction, because that does vary across persons, about a little less than 1/3 of that is due to genetics. So genetics does play some contribution to job satisfaction, though it's not necessarily large. And that's important because what that tells us is that there are other factors like social factors, factors that are related to the job itself, that play a bigger role in job satisfaction than genetics do. Does self-esteem actually affect job satisfaction? And some research has potentially indicated that. Generally, people with higher self-esteem are going to select more challenging tasks. Those people might have a very high growth need strength. They like to challenge themselves, and they'll be generally satisfied with their job. Now, other researchers have looked at what is called organization-based self-esteem, or OBSE. This is employees' perceptions of their value at work. Generally, you're going to be a lot more satisfied at your job if you actually feel like you're valued. And I can tell you that some of the rougher points of jobs that I've worked at before have occurred in situations where I felt that my bosses did not value my work. And so that actually hurt how I felt about my value at that organization at that time. You're going to be a lot more satisfied if it feels like what you're doing matters. OBSE also predicts overall satisfaction, commitment to the organization, and greater job involvement. And we'll talk a little bit more about organizational commitment within the next lecture. So, what about social factors? We know that satisfaction can be associated with good interactions with coworkers and supervisors. Relationships are a really important indicator. There are jobs that I've absolutely loved because of the people. There are jobs I have absolutely hated because of the people. And it turns out that this plays a really important role in whether or not we like our jobs. There are so many statistics out there that suggest that a lot of people quit their jobs because they have difficulty with their bosses. So this social aspect cannot be underestimated. Now, what other social aspects related to bosses actually affect job satisfaction? We generally tend to find that the more demographically similar supervisors and subordinates are, that tends to increase job satisfaction. How supervisors choose to assign tasks, whether or not subordinates perceive that supervisors have violated their expectations. So if supervisors cross boundaries, or on the other hand, if they treat you like a stranger, that's going to play a role as well. Other social factors do include coworker relationships. Generally, one of the things that we find is that if jobs get restructured and you now have to work in a new department or with a new team, we know that research shows that that restructuring modifies work interactions, and it might actually change satisfaction as a result. Role variables also matter. If you're not sure what your role or your purpose is at your job, your satisfaction will be poorer. And additionally, another social factor is organizational justice. And we kind of talked about this a little bit when we talked about equity theory last week. Do employees perceive that policies, procedures, and treatment are fair? If they don't, job satisfaction is going to be pretty low. If you feel like your workplace is an unfair place to be, you're not going to like your job. If you feel like your workplace is fair, you will like your job more. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we will start in the next one.